still have a dream.
No justice! No peace! No justice!
Free at last! Free at last! Thank God Almighty! We are free at last!
Hello, I'm Mike Ruzi. Martin Luther King Jr. was a civil rights icon and champion of nonviolent protest. His legacy lives on in the movements for justice that continue through today. And over the next half hour, we're taking a closer look at Dr. King's legacy and how people in our region are continuing the work to promote equality. In a year like any other, politics and the coronavirus dominated headlines in 2020, but as spring turned to summer, those topics were pushed aside as the national conversation shifted to systemic racism. March of 2020, Breonna Taylor, a 26-year-old emergency worker, was killed during a botched drug raid at her Louisville, Kentucky apartment. Months after her death, advocates and her family's legal team pushed for the officers involved with the drug raid to face prosecution.
Please, I can't breathe.
On May 25th, 46-year-old African-American George Floyd from Minneapolis died after being handcuffed and pinned to the ground by police officers. His death led to months of demonstrations across the world. His death was compared to that of Eric Gardner, who died in New York after officers placed him in a chokehold during an arrest.
I am live on State Street, the intersection of 7th and State, right by City Hall.
Locally, in late May, this was the scene in Perry Square, downtown Erie. An estimated 400 protesters, some of them threw fireworks at Erie police officers. Police responded with tear gas. Before midnight, this protest turned into a riot, and a state of emergency was declared. In early June, an estimated 2,500 people joined Bishop Dwayne Brock of the Victory Christian Center in a peaceful, silent protest. Participants kneeled in silence, remembering the events of May 25th in Minneapolis. And last year, we spoke with Dr. King's son, Martin Luther King III. As Brianna Andrews reports, local faith leaders have continued the fight against racial equality in the year since.
There's a long road ahead when it comes to ending racial inequality in America. Local activist Gary Horton and Pastor Lamont Higginbottom are proud of the strides Erie made, but since my exclusive interview with Martin Luther King III, they say there's still a long way to go. Riots, protests, and multiple killings of unarmed Black Americans. Disturbing realities of the year 2020.
The reality for persons of color is that this is life and this is how it's always been.
Black Americans are killed by police at more than twice the rate of white Americans, according to recent data by the Washington Post. Another reason why Second Baptist Church pastor Lamont Higginbottom is on the front lines, leading the fight against racial inequalities in Erie.
We do have a lot of work to do, but we've always had a lot of work to do.
Last January, I sat down for a one-on-one exclusive interview with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s son, Martin Luther King III, discussing America's racial climate. I'm curious, what are your thoughts on your father's dream in 2020? Has it been fulfilled?
You know, I'd have to say that elements of the dream have been achieved, but the fulfillment of the dream is not, unfortunately not yet in sight.
His answer, not surprising to Gary Horton, president of Erie's NAACP.
Well, it didn't take Martin Luther King III, first of all, to come here for us to see that we have a long way to go.
In 2019, the USA Today ranked Erie number 15 in the nation as worst places for African Americans to live. Supporting data revealed large disparities in income, health, and other socioeconomic measures between Black and white residents. While the city steps towards progression, Gary Horton believes Erie deserves better.
Diversity, equity, and inclusion all too often are empty words. You can't match them with action and the opportunities that exist in our community today.
While the journey is far from over, both leaders are hopeful change will happen in Erie, especially under Erie Mayor Joe Schember, who is vowing to end racism in Erie during his time in office. Reporting for The Dream Then and Now, Brianna Andrews, Erie News Now.
Coming up, civil rights icon Fred Rush discusses Erie's progress toward equality and tells you what you can do to make the city a better place to live. That's next on The Dream Then and Now.
live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
Dr. King's message was renewed in 2020 through the Black Lives Matter movement. Our Washington correspondent Matt Knadler examines how Dr. King's legacy is connected to the BLM movement and the power of television.
We remember these images from last summer. Minneapolis police kneeling on George Floyd's neck for nearly 9 minutes before he died. Breonna Taylor killed by police in Kentucky. And Ahmaud Arbery killed while jogging in Georgia after he was pursued by 3 white men. Collectively, the deaths reignited the debate over racial inequality in the United States and sparking nationwide protests, some peaceful, others violent, and the Black Lives Matter movement. What do you think he would think of some of the things we have seen this year?
Well, I think that he would be shocked that we're still dealing with these things.
Lopez Matthews Jr. is a historian at Howard University in Washington, D.C. It's perhaps the most prominent historically black college and university in the country. Critics argued the violent protests were far from Dr. King's message more than a half-century ago. But Matthews says the goal is the same, to achieve equality and equity.
People say Dr. King promoted peace, but he promoted nonviolence because he did promote direct action and direct confrontation. That's what the protests were.
Matthews says part of Dr. King's legacy is the power of television, used to highlight racial injustice in 2020, similar to the protests King led in the 1960s.
He understood what those cameras could do. They could shine a light on what was happening to black people around the country. And so that's sort of the same thing that social media is doing today. You have the videos that are showing you this is what's really happening.
As for the Black Lives Matter movement, do you think this is a lasting legacy? We're going to hear this for years to come.
I think we'll hear about it for years to come, but I really think that it's up to the leadership in this country to make changes to make it be a lasting change.
In Washington, for Martin Luther King Day 2021, The Dream Then and Now, I'm Matt Knadler.
And how can Erie carry out Dr. King's mission of equality? Civil rights icon Erie's Fred Rush has some ideas, and he shared them with our Ethan Kibbe.
Despite a tumultuous year of civil unrest, Fred Rush says Erie is becoming a more accepting area.
I think with the marches they've had and the talk about police brutality and everything, we're raising the level of consciousness. We're not there yet, but maybe we can see it over the horizon.
He says that's a start, but what people of color really need is economic opportunity. When the area thrives, they need to as well.
And what people have to understand is everybody rises, everybody rises. You can't just leave them behind because they'll still be there. A rising tide doesn't lift all boats, as some boats are tied to the mooring. It floods them.
What can the day-to-day person, me, what can I do to advance equality in our area?
The first thing you do is recognize each other's humanity. The only difference, basically, when you look at the world, 80% of the world is of color, black, brown, red, or yellow. Only 20% is Western European or white. You have to make friends.
He says achieving the dream really is that simple, but it's not always easy to do.
We have to work together. We'll either, what they say, grow as saints or perish as fools.
For The Dream Then and Now, I'm Ethan Kibbe.
Coming up, I'm sitting down with the next generation to see what their vision of the dream looks like. That's next on The Dream Then and Now.
No peace! No peace!
And we wanted to know what the next generation of leaders thinks the future of civil rights looks like. Our John Stalen sat down with students at the Robert Benjamin Wiley School to hear more.
On a normal school day, Robert Benjamin Wiley School would be filled with students. However, times are different, and in more ways than one. For example, decades ago, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was leading millions on a movement that would bring equality to black Americans.
I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted.
We brought in several students one by one following social distancing guidelines to see if the values of Dr. King then are alive in our young people now. My first question, who was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.?
Martin Luther King Jr., he was a civil rights activist.
He was a lot of things. He was a father. He was somebody who inspired the whole world.
A priest, a graduate from Boston University.
The students definitely understand what Dr. King did and feel that a national holiday in his name is important.
Is to honor him from helping us be treated the same way as white people.
And he gave his life for it. And he impacted history in a really big way.
The students are well aware of the state of our country today and are split if Dr. King would be pleased.
No. Yes, I think he'd be proud. I think he'd be proud because he sees people united and standing together.
I think he would be disappointed because of what he worked for is still happening today.
Despite today's turmoil, these students are still optimistic for a brighter future.
I want everyone to be able to live together without any problems, not just based on their color of skin, but also who they love, their religion.
I want the people who treated the black people different from how they're treated to stop.
For The Dream Then and Now, I'm John Stalen.